Greetings, I am Marino Restrepo, and I am here in Poland, in Warsaw, at the Angels Magazine studio, and I was asked to share with you a story of my encounter with God that has changed my life. And it is an honor for me to share the story with all the people that tunes in through this apostolate of St. Michael the Archangel, my favorite angel. And I can begin by telling you that I was born in Colombia in a small coffee growers town up in the Andes Mountains in a Catholic family. I am the number 6 of 10 children. And I grew up with all the teachings and traditions of the Catholic faith. But when I was 14 years old, I was sent to Bogota, the capital of Colombia, and those were the 1960s. I ran into the hippie culture, and Colombia had many American youngsters that were running away from the Vietnam War. And so they came to Colombia with the rock and roll and the hallucinating drugs and the Eastern pagan religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and all of the isms that lead you to the abysm, because that's how I fell into a terrifying new age type of life since I was a teenager. I walked away from my Catholic faith, and before I was 20 years old, I got married in Bogota and moved to Germany, to the city of Hamburg. I lived there close to 7 years and studied at the University of Hamburg and became an actor and a musical composer. My 2 sons were born there, and then I moved to Los Angeles, California. There I lived over 20 years working with the entertainment industry. All of these years since I left my hometown at age 14, I lived them away from God. The only person that will speak to me about God was my mother. She used to visit with me in California every 2 or 3 years, and she will always tell me that if I continue on living the life I was living and die like that, I will be in a lot of trouble with God. I loved my mother very much, but I thought her religion was something of the past, so I never paid attention to her counseling. In year 97, everything changed. I went to Colombia during Christmas of that year, and that Christmas was very sad in the family. Within the 4 years prior to that Christmas, we lost 5 people in the family, one after another. First, my wife died to cancer. Then my younger brother died in an accident in the Bahamas, in the sea. And then my father passed away. Shortly after that, another brother of mine committed suicide in Bogota, and a few months later, my mother died. That Christmas, we were 4 sisters and me left. My sisters were Catholics that practiced their faith, and they didn't know I didn't practice my faith. The only one that knew was my mother, but she never told them. So they invited me to church to pray the Divine Infant's Christmas Novena, which is a very old Catholic tradition in Colombia. I went to church and didn't tell my sisters that I haven't been in a Catholic church for 33 years, and joined them for the novena prayers, and the priest introduced the novena saying, when you pray this novena with faith, the baby Jesus will grant you a grace. I asked the baby Jesus to change my life. Obviously, The change of life I was asking was something totally materialistic. But the baby Jesus granted me a change of life that Christmas, obviously his way, and in a very painful way, as you're going to hear. The novena ends on the 24th of December at midnight mass, and on the 25th Christmas Day, I decided to spend the night at a coffee ranch plantation of one of my uncles. As I was driving through the gate of the ranch in a jeep, 6 guerrillas from the Revolutionary Army of FARC of Colombia jumped out of the woods with machine guns and kidnapped me. They tied me up, put a hood over my head, and took me prisoner to the jungle. In the jungle, they put me away in a cave. And altogether, I was kidnapped for 6 months. The first 15 days I spent in that cave. They were waiting for another group of guerrillas to come and pick me up. On the day 15, when they arrived, they asked me for a pretty large sum of money. And if I was to refuse it, they will kill my family. They also told me that as soon as I pay the ransom, I will be executed because I was sentenced to death. So they tied me up again, put the hood back on my head. They told me the next day they were going to transfer me somewhere else and put me away in the cave again. That night was the night when Jesus appeared to me. I was completely destroyed as a human being. I had no hope of making it out alive from that jungle. All my family were in danger of getting killed. The biggest God I had in my life was money, and they were going to steal it all from me. I was 47 years old that night. All of a sudden, I enter in what we know as an ecstasy. I didn't know I was in an ecstasy. I thought I was dying because I found myself in that ecstasy in the inside patio of the house where I was born in my hometown, age 3, on a tricycle with a stick in my hand, going through the gardens of the house, hitting the plants and the flowers, and I could hear May telling me not to do that. I was in total panic, but I couldn't get off the ecstasy. I continue on reliving my life little by little. By the time I was going through age 10 or 11, I began to go through the most excruciating pain. It wasn't a physical pain. It was the pain of my conscience. For 33 years I lived in mortal sin, and my conscience had been sleeping. Also, I had lost the fear of God, and the fear of God returned to my heart, so this made it even more painful. I could perfectly see the sense of sin, the consequences of sin, how much I had hurt people, how much I had offended God, how much I had placed my soul in danger, and I continue on reliving my life. The older I gotten, the more serious the sins, the more painful. I think I went through my whole life. As I told you, I was 47 years old that night. This first part, we can call it an illumination of conscience. That's what it was. Now, I continue on in the ecstasies, and now something more mysterious happened. I appeared face down against the grass in what felt to be like a pretty high mountain, in a silence that I can only call it a perfect silence, like I had never experienced before. When I looked ahead of me in the distance, I could see another mountain even higher, and the top of the mountain was covered with fog. The fog began to fade away slowly. And once gone, the most extraordinary city of light appeared on that mountain. I was in total awe, and my soul knew I had to have been there and didn't make it. I grew really worried and looked to see how I can get there, but the two mountains were not connected, so I was even more worried. And at that moment, I began to hear the sound of big waters that were approaching me. I couldn't see them, but I could hear them. And then it turned into many, many voices in perfect harmony. I couldn't tell if they were singing or praying, but they were precious and they were in perfect harmony. And after a while, they turned into one voice. And that voice was coming from everywhere. Though I had been away from God for so many years, the moment I heard the voice, I knew it was God's voice. And since I have had my illumination of conscience, I knew the terrifying state of sin my soul was in. So that voice was burning me. I couldn't bear with it. I wanted to disappear. But the Lord held me there in His compassion and spoke to me at length. Among the things He said that I can share with you in this short space, He talked about the church. And He said with these exact words, "The Catholic Church is my church. I chose you from the womb of your mother, and you deserted it." He was not accusing me, because He was perfect love, but I was accusing myself. It was very painful to see. And then He spoke about Catholics, and He said, "We are a chosen people, a people set apart, a predestined people," as St. Paul also tells us. And he said, "We are Eucharistic instruments of reparation, in charge of the salvation of all of humanity." And then he spoke about priesthood, and he said, "There is no human being on earth that carries a greater power against evil than a holy priest." He said, "A holy priest will make hell tremble." And then he spoke about the sacrament of confession. And he said, because we have been created to be Catholics, to be instruments of the Eucharist, we need to be fed through the sacraments. And the moment I walked away from the sacraments, I became undernourished. And then the spirit of the world seduced me, and I didn't have the strength to defend myself, and I was seduced for 33 years. That was so painful. I could never explain to you what I felt. To see what I have walked into all my life. And then he compared the sacrament of confession with an exorcism, because he told me, a mortal sin is a demon, is a spirit, is a person. And when we stay in mortal sin, the longer we are in mortal sin, the more demons that unite to that sin, and we end up with a legion. And only the Catholic Church, through the sacrament of confession, by the hands of the priest, can untie us, free us from the devil. And after this, he spoke to me about the Eucharist, and he said, "The greatest gift that the Almighty Father has granted to all of humanity is the Eucharist." He said, "It is the greatest gift ever." That's why We are instruments of the greatest gift. That the biggest mission of a Catholic is the Eucharist. And the greatest gifts that we take with us the day we pass away into the next life is how many souls God could have rescued through our faithfulness to the Eucharist. And because every time we take communion, God is rescuing souls. Now he spoke to me about the priest coming into the sacristy and dressing up with the liturgical vestments. He spoke to me about the spiritual battle that begins before the Mass, when the priest is all dressed up and comes out to the altar and kisses the altar. A big light descends from heaven on the spiritual territory that covers the altar where the Mass is being celebrated. And all demonic activities in that spiritual territory cease, because demons can stand the light and they run away. So during the Mass, there is a lot of freeing and delivering and healings. And then he says that when we are assisting Mass and we are in grace with God and we come to communion, Jesus Eucharist uses our communion to rescue souls from eternal damnation. At the moment we take communion, there are many people dying around the world, and many are in danger of condemnation. Jesus Eucharist rescues souls every time we take communion. That's why he called us Eucharistic instruments of reparation. When we walk away from the Mass, wherever we go, we are like columns of light and demons flee. So he reminds me of a passage of St. Paul where he says, "Do not dare to come before the altar of the Lord to eat of this bread if you are not prepared, because you will lead your own condemnation." And he told me why it was so serious and important to understand how we have to be meticulous in our preparation to take communion. Now, he spoke to me about the 10 Commandments and the 7 capital sins. So he said, the 7 capital sins are 7 legions of demons that fight the law of God. And he showed me 3 capital sins that were prominent in my life since I was a boy, and how each one of us has a spiritual battle with different legions of demons during our life, and how important it is to detect which ones are those. Usually we know, but it's good to look at them so we can fight them in a stronger fashion. So he placed me in a lake with the water up to my waist. In front of the lake there was a big rock. On top of the rock on the right side, I could see the head of a man looking sideways. At first I didn't know who he was. Then I looked back to the water where I was, and I noticed there was a fog floating on the water. When I looked at it closely, I noticed there were demons of my mortal sins of 33 years. They continue on towards an abyss, and I could see the abyss perfectly well, and I could see how deep down my soul has fallen because of the sinful life I lived. If I would have died that night, I would have been condemned. So I was really filled with anguish, and in this terrifying darkness, I looked up and I could see the only light that was there was the head of that man that was on top of the rock, and it ended up being my guardian angel. And he was the one that was showing me everything in the lake, because on the right side I saw the lowest part of the purgatory. And I couldn't go into details now because of the space we have, but I can tell you that the angel was not communicating with me with a voice like the Lord did. He was talking to my heart, and I was able to understand everything. I cannot explain how that works because I don't know, but I knew everything he was saying. He took me to my hometown at age 11, and I ended up in a procession of Our Lady, the Virgin Mary, and there he revealed to me the power of the rosary, the power of prayer. I appeared back in the lake, and the rock was filled with light. That light was Jesus. After a while, Our Lady appeared on the right side of the rock, and between Our Lady and Jesus, they were rescuing me from that darkness. I came off the ecstasies and spent 5.5 months more in the jungles as a prisoner after Jesus appeared to me. All I wanted was the Lord to grant me not to die in mortal sin. And 6 months later, a big miracle occurred. I was free by the guerrillas with no explanation. I know the guerrillas never knew why they let me go, because I knew it was a miracle from the Holy Spirit that took me out of the jungle. I went to confession, and that was my real freedom, because I knew all these demons that were in the lake, they were still in my life. And I knew only the sacrament of confession will free me. So that was the biggest day of my life when I went to confession and walked away from that absolution. Went back to California to my home, spent 2 years learning to be a Catholic, where I didn't tell anyone about my experience with God. And after these 2 years, the Lord showed me clearly during a Holy Week in Bogota this mission I'm in now. So I could tell you that a sinner like me, to have gone through what I gone through, only shows us God's mercy. Because if God rescue me, He can rescue anyone. So I am a witness of God's mercy and compassion. And also I can testify with my life that the Catholic Church is the church of the Lord Jesus, who founded this church. And as Catholics, we are members of His army. And I also testify that it's real that hell does exist, that Satan does exist, that we have for sure a purgatory and a heaven. And we are the victory as Catholics when we understand how we need to be faithful to God in order to conquer our life.